Well, hello everyone. I'm Mayor Diane Marlin from Urbana, Illinois. It's July 9th, 2020. So to say that we're in challenging times is an understatement. We are at a crossroads in history. We're navigating a global pandemic, and as a nation, we're facing a very uncertain future at this time. And at the same time, we're confronting hundreds of years of systemic racism, and we are locally examining the impact of that in many institutions. One of those institutions is policing in America, in our state, and in our community. We're looking at the purpose, the roles, oversight and accountability, and alternative emergency response models. So as members of Urbana's Civilian Police Review Board, you'll play a very important role over the next months and years. Our CPRB process, the ordinance that provides the framework for it, will need to be revised to better fit the needs of the community today and moving forward. You've already begun this very important work, and we will guide and support these efforts and work with you. So the key to that support and guidance is adequate, consistent staffing and resources. We acknowledge that City of Urbana's support over the years has been inconsistent, especially due to staff turnover and time allocated to CPRB. We also haven't really on a regular basis reviewed the enabling ordinance to ensure that it kept pace with the changing times. And that said, the ordinance in place today is the one we must abide by, and with the understanding that you are already hard at work to develop recommendations to the City Council for changes. Going forward, we're committed to revising the ordinance to meet the needs of the city and the community, and to providing the staffing necessary to ensure police accountability and civilian oversight of policing in the City of Urbana. I want to thank you sincerely for volunteering. Some of you have been on this board from the very beginning, some of you are newer members, but all of you will play a very important role in developing the policies, the ordinance, and the processes that meet the needs of our community today.
I'm going to cover a couple of topics today, but before I do, I just want to thank you for your service on the CPRB. It's a very challenging board to serve on, but ultimately it's very satisfying, and you're doing good work for the community. So thank you for being willing to serve. I'm going to cover a few topics, and the first one I'm going to talk about is the history of civilian oversight of law enforcement. So there's basically been three eras of waves of effort in this area. And the first one really took place between the 1920s and the 1960s, and this was the earliest efforts at establishing some kind of civilian oversight of law enforcement. It started in larger cities, and some of the first cities that started it were Washington, D.C., New York City, and Philadelphia. The early efforts were strongly influenced by the civil rights movement, and they almost exclusively used the review model, and I'll explain the models in another segment, but the review model is basically what Urbana has. And that model typically uses volunteer members and has a small budget. They encountered at that time, as you might imagine, the 20s to the 60s, significant resistance from police unions as well as local politicians and policymakers. And so that first wave of effort largely failed. So then the next wave of effort came in the 1970s and the 1980s, and that's when we saw the emergence of the investigative model of civilian oversight. The characteristics of this second wave of effort were that more resources were allocated to the effort, there was greater durability to those efforts, the authority of the bodies doing the oversight was expanded to include this investigative role, and many of those are still operating today. And then the final sort of era, and this is the one that we're in now, it started in the 1990s, and that was when a new model emerged called the audit or monitor form of civilian oversight, and some use a hybrid model that combines the auditor function with the investigative function or the review function. They still take individual complaints. But what this new model added is an audit function. And the audit function seeks to examine sort of systemic patterns of behavior either in complaints or in critical incidents or in the types of officer misconduct that are being observed, and then seeks to change those systemic problems rather than deal with individual concerns about officer misconduct. So one example of that, and it's really a hybrid model, is Seattle, Washington. So they basically have a three-pronged model. One of the efforts is called the Office of Police Accountability, and that office handles they do the investigations of allegations of police officer misconduct. Then there's another body called the Community Police Commission. That commission provides community input on policing and reform efforts. And then finally, there is an Office of Inspector General for Public Safety, and that handles this systemic audit function. So they really have three distinct bodies in Seattle that handle that. So that's a good example of a hybrid model. Just as a point of reference, Seattle has a population of about 720,000 people and more than 1,400 sworn police officers and 580 civilian police employees. So that's a big difference relative to Urbana. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the benefits of civilian oversight of the police. There's a variety of benefits, and the model is often fitted to the community situation in terms of the benefits that are being sought. So among those benefits are that civilian oversight can preserve or, in certain cases, restore or enhance public trust in law enforcement. And it's important that we have public trust, not only that people feel confident that they're being protected by people that are properly trained and that are using their training properly, but it also helps to increase community cooperation with the police when crimes are being investigated. Another benefit is that it makes the complaint process more accessible to people, so that people may feel more comfortable speaking with other civilians rather than people in uniform. And we need to make a concerted effort to make sure that we give voice to the underserved or underrepresented as we enhance our efforts to make the complaint process more accessible. It protects citizens' civil rights, and it's also a tool for risk management for jurisdictions, because if there are actions being taken by police officers that are exposing the city to lawsuits, that's something that we want to know about and deal with. And also, if actions are being taken by officers that expose they themselves to greater physical harm, we want to know that too. There are also some drawbacks to civilian oversight, and I wanted to mention those as well. So sometimes there's concern about unfair treatment of officers who aren't guilty of misconduct but have merely had a complaint lodged against them. And that's why management of the complaint process is so important. Sometimes it discourages efficiency by police officers who might be fearful about complaints being lodged against them. So in those situations, officers might stop enforcing certain laws or stop enforcing them relative to a certain group of people because they feel that they're more vulnerable to criticism as a result. In certain jurisdictions, and I know this was more true historically, I think we're at a different point in time, but it's considered to, in some instances, to undermine the authority of the police chief. Because in some models, the internal affairs, just as a for instance, the internal affairs function, which is normally within the police department, sometimes is taken out of the police department. So that's something that, as an example, that an independent entity is now providing oversight to a function that was formerly part of the police chief's purview. Sometimes there's a concern that there are harsher penalties resulting from citizen oversight bodies when the citizens who are serving on them are unfamiliar with law enforcement realities. And that's why the technical training that you'll get subsequent to this orientation is so important, because then you really get a much better understanding of the circumstances under which police officers do their work and how they're trained. And then the final drawback is that sometimes it can foster, civilian oversight can foster hostility between police and the community, which is exactly the opposite result being sought, because we really want to foster trust, but it can result when board members are viewed as advocates for a certain perspective. And that can be an advocate for the police or an advocate for the community to the exclusion of one or the other group. So balance is very important. So now I want to spend a little time talking about the general models of civilian oversight of police departments. And there are three, and they basically mirror those three periods in history that I talked about earlier. So the three general models are: there's an investigation-focused model, a review-focused model, and an auditor/monitor-focused model. So I'm going to talk about each of those, just describe them a little bit, maybe give a few examples, and then talk about the key strengths and key weaknesses of each of those. So the first is an investigation-focused model, and that is very focused on independent investigations of complaints. So the body is empowered to do independent investigations rather than relying on investigations done by the police. It can replace or duplicate the police internal affairs function, and they're typically staffed by civilian investigators. So the structure of those kinds of models can vary, but I have a few examples that I wanted to share. One is in Seattle, the Office of Police Accountability. So this is one of those three prongs that I talked about earlier. That Office of Police Accountability has a staff of 25 people, including 9 sworn investigators and 2 civilian investigators. And that's, again, for a police department with more than 1,400 sworn officers. In Washington, D.C., where I lived for many years, there is the Office of Police Complaints. The executive director there oversees a staff of 19, and there are 7 investigators on staff, 2 senior investigators on staff, and 1 chief investigator on staff, along with various other folks. And the District of Columbia has a sworn police force of 3,800 officers. And then in smaller jurisdictions, sometimes these offices can be staffed by a single investigator or a consultant. And there are some other examples of how investigations are handled that I'll share in a few minutes. The potential key strengths of an investigative model: it can reduce investigation bias, although typically the training that these investigators have is related to the kinds of training that police officers get. It requires highly trained civilian investigators, and it may increase the community's trust in the investigation process because of the independence. There are some potential key weaknesses to this model as well. It is expensive and organizationally complex. So I just described a few examples, and they're well staffed, and it is expensive. Sometimes there's resistance by police personnel when the internal affairs function is removed from the police department. And it can also create disillusionment in the community when expectations are not met. So sometimes there's a more global desire for systemic change in the police department, and an investigative model, even though it provides a certain level of independence, it doesn't always result in the changes in terms of policy. So that's a potential weakness of that model. Now, what we have here in Urbana is a review-focused model that focuses on the quality and conclusions of police-conducted internal investigations. The body can make recommendations to the police regarding its findings or request further investigation, but it doesn't have an independent power to issue discipline or otherwise implement their findings. The review board, as in the case here in Urbana, is commonly composed of citizens who are volunteers, and the review focus model may hold public meetings for input and communication. And it's really more of an intent to be a vehicle for community input into the review process rather than full independent ownership of the review process. So these vary in organizational structure. So you're familiar with the way we're structured here in Urbana, but a couple of other examples I wanted to share with you that I think are interesting. In Albany, New York, they have a CPRB, just like we do, but it has a unique arrangement in that it is supported by the Government Law Center at the Albany Law School. So they perform some of the staffing function for the CPRB, and they have appointees that some of the appointees are mayoral appointees and others are appointees by the council. And then in Indianapolis, they have something called the Citizens Police Complaint Board. The mayor appoints 4 of those board members, the council appoints 7, and the Fraternal Order of Police appoints 1, and then they have 3 non-voting sworn police officers that also participate. So the potential key strengths of the review model are it ensures the public a certain amount of input into the process. It can increase public trust in the police department, and it is the least expensive model because it relies largely on volunteers. The potential key weaknesses of this review model are that it can be limited in authority and limited in resources. Volunteers may be inexperienced in police work and also limited in time. So again, there'll be further technical training to try and make up for the inexperience you might have in police work. And all we can do is thank you for investing the time in order to get that additional training. And it is typically less independent than other models. So finally, we have the auditor or monitor focused model. So that adds, it's not always exclusively that it looks at broader patterns in police complaints and investigations, but it typically adds that element to it. Auditors or monitors may actively participate in open investigations, and the focus of this model is more to promote organizational change by systemically reviewing policies, practices, and trainings. So the focus tends to be on larger scale reform, which is sometimes anticipated with an investigative model, as I said, but the structure doesn't necessarily ensure that. There's typically broader access to records, although through Urbana's open data portal, I think that the public typically has access to quite a few police records. And I'll give you a few examples of this type of model. In San Jose, California, they have an independent police auditor with a staff of 5, no investigators. I think they contract out their investigations. But then they also have, as a companion piece, they have a community advisory board, and they help define what community policing means in the city of San Jose. So the independent auditor has a staff of 5, then the community advisory board has a membership of 15, and San Jose has about 1 million people and almost 1,000 sworn officers. Denver has an office of the independent monitor, which has, they monitor a variety of activities, and they also take complaints. They have 15 employees, and then the Citizen Oversight Board actually has findings. They conduct the hearings and so forth. They have 9 citizens on that board, and they have on their staff, they have monitors, so those are more like the investigators. They have policy analysts, and then they have people that are whose job it is to conduct community engagement. And then in New Orleans, they have an independent police monitor with a staff of 6, again, no investigators, so they hire that function out. So the potential key strengths of the auditor model are it's a typically most robust public reporting practices, because they typically will do annual reports, and they will, as I said, they're looking at more systemic type of activities. It's mid-range in terms of the expense of the model, and it may be effective at promoting lasting systemic change in the police department. A potential key weakness of the auditor model is that they focus on patterns rather than cases, although, as I mentioned, they typically have a supplemental function that handles the police complaints itself, but that means there's more than one body, which makes it more expensive. There's significant expertise required, and typically the auditor or monitor, as in most cases, and where there's an independent auditor in any kind of community, they just recommend changes. They can't actually implement the changes. So they need cooperation from whoever is the executive and the police department themselves. So that's a little bit of history on the development of civilian oversight of law enforcement and some of the models that exist out there. The last thing that I wanted to do, and the mayor mentioned it in her opening remarks, is talk just very briefly about the history of the Civilian Police Review Board here in Urbana. So there was a task force that I think they worked for a couple of years, starting around 2005, and it wasn't until 2007 that the first ordinance was passed that established the Civilian Police Review Board in Urbana. And one of the features of that at the time was there was a provision in there. If you're interested in going back and looking, it was I think it was 1940, Section 1940, and it was that the ordinance was subject to review every couple of years, and so then we had the initial in 2007, and then it was reviewed again in 2009, and it was reauthorized in 2009 with that same provision in it for a 2-year review, and it was reauthorized again in 2011, and at that time they removed that provision for periodic review, which is why we haven't really had a comprehensive review until now, when there's a much more attention on the CPRB. But there was another amendment to the ordinance in 2015, and that's when the CPRB was given authority of oversight over the deployment and use of tasers. So that's a little bit of the history of CPRB in Urbana, and you're part of the future of the CPRB in Urbana. And again, thank you very much for your service.
Hi, my name is Rich Searles. I'm the Deputy Chief of Police. I'm here to describe the intake process for citizen complaints. In describing the intake procedures for police complaints, I will describe how we intend for the process to work. As of the date of this recording, July 9th, 2020, this is not exactly how we process complaints currently, it should be noted. The Human Relations Office, or the HRO, is going to be the single point of entry to the complaint process. Complaints can be submitted either electronically or in person. When a complaint is received, the HRO provides an initial analysis of the complaint, any follow-up questioning of the complainant, and the processing of the complaint itself. The initial analysis centers on the general eligibility for a complaint, such as, is the signed attestation complete? Is the employee in question a sworn police officer? Has the complaint been submitted within applicable time limits, etc.? If there are unanswered questions about the eligibility of the complaint, the HRO will make those inquiries and related determinations. The complaint is then logged, numbered, and disseminated to the police department. The HRO compiles the complaint files, acts as a central registry of complaints, and provides notice of the receipt of a complaint to the CPRB and sends the complainant notice of receipt of the complaint also. With respect to the investigation of the complaint, upon receipt of a complaint by the police department, it's forwarded to the Deputy Chief of Police. The Deputy Chief then assigns it to a supervisor for investigation. That assignment will depend on the nature of the complaint. Lower level complaints are generally assigned to shift level sergeants, and complaints with more complicated or serious allegations are typically assigned to division lieutenants. Should the complaint be against the police chief, then the deputy chief would conduct the investigation himself or herself. Under those circumstances, the city administrator would be engaged to make the final determination related to the complaint. Normally, the police chief is the person that makes the final determination on complaints. With respect to findings of the police chief, upon completion of the investigation, the chief of police prepares and sends the complainant a disposition letter. That letter outlines the findings of the chief. This letter includes a section on how to appeal his or her decision and the time limit within which the appeal needs to be submitted. That time limit is 30 days from the receipt of the findings letter by the complainant. With respect to hearings, should the chief's finding be appealed to the CPRB, the HRO is responsible for the coordination and scheduling of the hearing. This hearing should be completed within 45 working days of the receipt of the appeal notice. If the hearing cannot be held within that time limit, the CPRB is responsible to provide a written basis to the complainant and the police department on the need for the extension. When the appeal hearing occurs, the CPRB opens their meeting in open session. Once in open session, a motion is made to move the meeting to a closed session for the purpose of conducting the hearing. This is required by the Open Meetings Act. A hearing officer is present to swear in witnesses and advise the CPRB regarding such things as evidentiary matters. The appeal hearing is conducted in closed session. The CPRB members are required to keep confidential all matters discussed or disclosed during the appeals hearing, including the internal investigation reports. The hearing provides the complainant an opportunity to make statement to the CPRB that details the basis of the appeal. A non-union police department representative and/or other city staff member is also afforded the opportunity to explain the basis for the department's findings and conclusions. At no time is the complainant privy to what the city staff or police department said or submitted. Likewise, the city staff or police department representatives are not privy to what the complainant said or submitted. With respect to disposition of complaints, after the CPRB hears the information from both sides, they will deliberate in private. Clarifying questions might be asked of the complainant or the police department staff. Upon final conclusion, the CPRB would return to an open session and the CPRB casts a public vote per section 19-33 of the CPRB ordinance. The CPRB has 5 options when rendering their findings: not sustained, sustained, remanded for further investigation, no finding, or mediated.
The Civilian Police Review Board has responsibilities in 4 key areas. Number 1, policy review and recommendations. As established in Section 19-20 of the Civilian Police Review Board Ordinance, the CPRB shall provide a systematic means by which to achieve continuous improvement in police-community interactions, review internal police investigations, establish an independent process to review citizen complaints, provide fair treatment to and protect the rights of police officers, and review taser displays and usage by the Urbana Police Department, and where appropriate, make recommendations to the mayor, the city council, and the chief of police concerning their display and use. Number 2, quarterly meetings. Section 19-35 of the ordinance states, the CPRB shall conduct quarterly meetings that provide the general public with an opportunity to voice concerns and to provide recommendations for improving interactions between the police department and the community. The CPRB quarterly meetings shall be open to the public, except when closed as provided in the Open Meetings Act. Number 3, community outreach. The CPRB will work with the Police Department, Human Relations Office, and Human Relations Commission to address community concerns and problems. The CPRB will develop brochures explaining CPRB procedures and the rights of complainants. The CPRB will develop a right to know poster to be displayed prominently in the police department. The CPRB will also develop and distribute police complaints in various languages and formats, and conducting periodic meetings with neighborhood groups, civic organizations, and our community leaders to discuss community concerns relating to public safety and police procedures. And finally, number 4, develop CPRB operational rules in consultation with the legal division. The HRO shall establish rules and procedures for the transactions of the CPRB.
Good afternoon. I'm Jim Simon. I'm the city attorney for the city of Urbana. And at the outset, I want to, like everyone else, thank you for your volunteering for this position and service on the Citizens Police Review Board. In today's changing world, you will face a lot of challenges, but we are all confident here in the city that you are up to it and will apply your wisdom and effort for good change. Again, thank you for your service. I'm going to cover 3 topics: the Open Meetings Act, sometimes referred to by people as OMA, the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, and the Peace Officers Disciplinary Act, commonly called the Police Officers Bill of Rights. Let's start with the Open Meetings Act. At the outset, for those who have not done so, you are required to take training, online training presented by the Public Access Counselor's Office in the Attorney General's office. For people who have not taken this training, you must do so within 90 days of being seated as a member on the board. I also recommend that those who've been on the board for a number of years also retake the training offered by the Attorney General's office. They update this periodically, and I'm sure you will find new things in the training as well as a good solid refresher. The training can be found at http:// Attorney General, that's all one word, attorneygeneral.net. Upon completion of your training, you will be able to download a certificate of completion. I ask that you do so and provide that or a copy of it to the city clerk's office so they can put that in their permanent records. The Open Meetings Act governs regular, special, and emergency meetings for public bodies. The CPRB is a public body, as we will discuss in a second. As you can imagine, and as its name implies, the Open Meetings Act is to assure that government business and action and the expenditure of tax dollars is open and in the sunshine to all citizens. Citizens have a right to know what their government is doing, and the Open Meetings Act provides for that. There are several definitions upon which the Act is built, and so you need to understand that because CPRB, you are a public body. Public body is defined as a body that is supported or expends tax revenue. Obviously, the City of Urbana supports the CPRB, and therefore that makes the board a public body, just as the City Council, the Committee of the Whole, and other boards and commissions within the city. They're all public bodies. Meeting has what appears to be a simple definition, but we're going to have to break that down. Essentially, a meeting is defined as a gathering of a majority of a quorum of the public body who have a contemporaneous, interactive communication about public business. Let's start out with a majority of a quorum. For bodies that have 7 members, such as the CPRB, a quorum, which is one more than half of the body, is required to conduct business. Thus, for CPRB purposes, a quorum is 4 members. Thus, a majority of a quorum of the members is 3 members of the CPRB. Thus, whenever 3 members come together and talk about public business for OMA purposes, that is a meeting and is subject to the Open Meetings Act. Contemporaneous interactive communication requires a little bit more discussion. Obviously, contemporaneous interactive communication occurs during regular, special, and emergency meetings, whether they are conducted in person, remotely, or a combination of both. However, emails, text messages, WhatsApp messages, Facebook messages, all these social medias and electronic medias can suddenly find you in the midst of a meeting. For example, if member A sends member B an email and member B forwards it to member C, and member C comments to member B about that email, that's a meeting for Open Meetings Act purposes, because they're talking about public business, presumably, and it involves 3 or more members of the body. If the chairman or chairperson sends an email to everyone on the CPRB, the other 6 members, and nobody comments, they just receive the information, that's not a meeting because there's no interactive communication. There's one-way communication. This all applies to texting, or even if you meet your colleagues at a party and 3 of you eventually go off into a corner and start talking about public business, that's a meeting for Open Meetings Act purposes. Passing on the street, 2 of you come out of a restaurant after having a good lunch at one of Urbana's fine restaurants, and you meet another member on the street and start talking about potholes and how Public Works is or is not promptly filling potholes. That's public business because it concerns business of the city. You're now in a meeting subject to the Open Meetings Act. Public business is not limited to just business concerning the CPRB or the ordinance under which you all operate, but it's the public body's business, and the city is a public body. So you have to be careful. For example, with emails, if you send it to 2 or more people, members on the board, please ask them not to reply all and not to discuss the contents of the email among themselves. Remember, anything you put in writing, whether it's electronic or hard copy, to 2 or more members possibly could be construed as a meeting, so be careful. Public business is obviously business of the public body, the city, the CPRB, what have you. Meeting types. As I suggested, there are 3 types of meetings under the Open Meetings Act. There are regular meetings. A regular meeting is one that is listed on the annual calendar of meetings that you adopt before the next calendar year. You list the date, time, and place of every meeting you anticipate having in the coming year, and that must be posted. Those are your regular meetings. Whether you have them or not, you can cancel them, but they're still on your list of regular meetings. Obviously, a special meeting is a meeting that's not on the regular meeting list, but can be called for any reason that a meeting is necessary, other than at a regular meeting. And then there are emergency meetings, probably a very rare entity for CPRB purposes, but these are meetings that are called where some form of action is absolutely necessary within, let's say, 24 or 48 hours. We've all heard about town hall meetings. The Open Meetings Act doesn't even use that phrase within the statute. A town hall meeting can be convened at a regular meeting or on a regular meeting date, time, and place. A special meeting can be called to conduct a town hall meeting. So, as I say, meetings fall into 3 classes: regular, those that are scheduled in advance; special, those that come up throughout the year; and emergency. As I indicated, your regular calendar of meetings must be posted on the city's website and wherever else the city posts regular meeting schedules of the council, the committee of the whole, your board, other boards and commissions. This will allow the public to know what the meeting schedule is. Further, if media, legitimate media, asks for notice of meetings throughout the year, you should provide them with your annual regular meeting schedule. Let's turn to notices and agendas. All meetings require notice, and for the most part, notices must be posted 48 hours before the time and date of the meeting, or when the meeting will be convened. For example, the City Council meets at 7 o'clock on Mondays, so their notice must be posted no later than 6:59 on Saturday evening in order to meet the 48-hour rule. The notice must be posted on the city's website and wherever else the city posts notices of meetings, and notice must be sent to the media that have requested notices of meetings. And by the way, the city clerk's office is a fabulous resource to help you with notices of meetings, how to organize them, what content they must have. But at a minimum, they must state the date, time, and location of the meeting. If it's going to be a remote meeting where you all remote in, or some of you remote in, then you're going to have to include the link for remoting in. Whoever sets up the meeting for you should provide the link on the notice. So every member can remote in and the public can remote in. There are new rules on remoting in, and I'll get to those in a little bit. Agendas. Of course, agendas should accompany and must accompany notices of meetings. They must be posted with the meeting. Now, if there are packets that go along with the agenda, packets typically contain information about action items that are coming up on the agenda. The packets don't necessarily have to be posted, but it is custom and practice to include that material, if it's available, 48 hours at the time the agenda and notice are posted. All action items, i.e. those types of items which are substantive and which a vote is anticipated. It may be a vote up or a vote down or a vote to continue to the next meeting, must appear on the public meeting notice. And obviously, notice or agendas of public meetings must include a place for public comment, public input. A typical agenda can be found in the city's ordinances pertaining to city council meetings. But a typical agenda looks like or contains the following: convening the meeting, i.e. calling the meeting to order, that's what the chair does. A roll call by either the secretary or whoever is acting as secretary, or it may be the deputy city clerk who does that for you. But there's a roll call of members to make sure the record shows who's present, who's absent, and to establish whether or not a quorum, i.e. 4 members or more, are present, whether in person or through remote or a combination of both. The next item on an agenda typically is approving prior meeting minutes. Maybe the last meeting, or maybe there are several meetings, including special meetings, whose minutes need approval. There typically is a place for additions to the agenda. If a member or two want to add something to the agenda, they can do so. However, if the item is one that's going to be substantive and require a vote, it can be added to the agenda, and when your board reaches that item, you can have all the discussion you would like. However, you cannot take a vote because it did not appear on the agenda at the time the agenda was posted along with the notice. So it's continued for vote, if that's what the board wants, continued to vote to the next meeting. Next typically is public comment. That's where the public, obviously, as you know, has the opportunity to speak its mind, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of minutes. Then maybe you're going to have a committee or two. That's like the task force, the traffic stop task force, or maybe some kind of task force on use of tasers. That's where those committees, or maybe a committee of the whole, make their presentations. It may be a staff person who you want to make a presentation, or some outside expert on a subject that you want a presentation on. That's typically where those occur. Then comes unfinished business. These are the substantive matters that have been continued from prior meetings. And action can be taken on those as long as they appear on the agenda. Doesn't matter whether you vote them up, vote them down, or once again continue them to another meeting. They have to be on the agenda. And then new business. For new action items, those are items that have yet to be considered, and the specific items must appear on the agenda. And then finally, adjournment. Special meetings and emergency meetings must have agendas as well. If the notices do not have information on how to remote and how to remote public comment, then the agenda certainly must, and that must be posted 48 hours along with the notice, as I indicated before. A special meeting agenda may have or should have convening the meeting, calling it to order, roll call. If there are any minutes to be approved of a prior special meeting or another meeting, you can do that then or do it at a later date. You probably won't have additions to agenda. You still must have public comment, and then it may be just one action item, the purpose for which the special meeting is called. You cannot conduct other business than that which is on a special or a regular meeting agenda. And the same holds true for emergency meetings. During a meeting, whether it be an emergency, a special, or a regular meeting, the board can go into closed session under certain circumstances, and those circumstances are provided in the Open Meetings Act. And the legal division and the city clerk's office can help you to determine whether a particular subject matter is amenable to closed meeting. But if you're going to go into closed meeting, on the agenda, you have to indicate that there will be a closed session, a brief, very generalized description of what the closed session will deal with, and then the citation to the Open Meetings Act pursuant to which the executive or closed session is being called. For example, if it's to discuss some kind of personnel matter, you find the exemption, and as I said, legal division or the city clerk can help you with that, and then you essentially quote the exemption and give the citation. That's satisfactory. As I said, meetings are conducted in the open, and you can't transact any business unless there is a quorum of the members. If 7 seats are filled, again, that's 4. If you're missing a person, which I understand there's a vacancy, that brings you down to 6, still a quorum is 4. A quorum essentially is 1 more than half. There has to be, if you go into closed session, there has to be a a motion to go into closed session, and a second, and then a vote. You go into closed session, you come back to the open session, there has to be a motion to go back into open session, a second, and a vote on that. You can take no action. You cannot vote on anything in a closed session. And you can only discuss that topic for which the closed meeting or portion of the meeting has been called. You can take straw polls to see how members are leaning on issues. They can't be binding. You can't compel a member to adhere to his or her straw poll vote. There must be minutes prepared for all meetings, including closed sessions. Emergency meetings, regular meetings, special meetings, all require minutes. And I strongly urge you to take separate set of minutes for the closed session from the open session. If you have a legitimate reason for closing a portion of the meeting, you certainly don't want those minutes to be leaked or knowingly made available to the public. That's the reason why you close the minutes. Regarding minutes of closed sessions, just be aware every 6 months you have to review all the minutes of all the closed sessions that have not been released, and you have to determine whether some or all of those minutes can now be released to the public. If you choose not to, and I'll discuss how you do that in a second, if you choose not to, in 6 months you've got to go through the same task of review. Of course, that's done in a closed session. Review closed meeting minutes. Once you've determined whether certain minutes can be made available to the public, you have to go back into open session and vote that those minutes can be released. Again, votes are required in open session. Now, as I mentioned, recently there's been an amendment to address the situation that we're facing today with the COVID-19 pandemic. The Open Meetings Act was amended to allow for remote meetings where there are disasters that have been declared, whether it's a pandemic, a tornado, what have you. A 747 taking out downtown Urbana, God forbid, whatever. But the governor has to declare an emergency, whether it's local or statewide, or the Illinois Department of Public Health Director must declare a disaster, again, in a particular area or the whole state. The head of the public body, that is the chair of the CPRB in this instance, must determine that it's not feasible to hold the meeting in its normal location. For example, right now, the city building is not open, and the mayor makes the determination whether to reopen the building. If she makes the determination the building remains closed, then the CPRB chair has no option but to indicate it's not feasible to hold the meeting in person in the city building. In order to hold a remote meeting, all members must be able to attend remotely, and their attendance must be verified, and that's done typically by roll call at the beginning of a meeting. All members must be able to hear each other and interact with each other. Remember the definition of a meeting: contemporaneous, interactive communication. The public must be able to attend the meeting. Doesn't mean they have to be able to view it, but they, at a minimum, must be able to hear all members speak during the meeting. The public must have a means for providing public comment. That can be done by using, in Zoom, the participant hand raise feature, or waving wildly to the camera, asking to be recognized if the members can see them, or submitting emails. The emails can be read during the public input portion, or can be made or incorporated into the record verbatim. And you can set a deadline by which emails must be received, but it should be no earlier than the beginning of the meeting. Every vote, no matter what kind of a vote it is, including a vote to continue a matter, a vote to alter the agenda, the order of the agenda, must be taken by roll call when the meeting is a remote meeting. And a verbatim record of the meeting, including any closed portion of a meeting, must be made, i.e. recorded, whether it's video or audio recording. And of course, if there's a closed session, the same applies. The way the city council does it is they have a remote in for the public and the members for the public session, and then just before going into the closed session, the secretary of the meeting or whoever set up the Zoom meeting sends out an email to the members with the link to just them to enter the closed session. I understand the CPRB has rules and procedures, and you are authorized to adopt them, especially because your ordinance provides you with authority to adopt rules. You can adopt rules on public comment as long as they're reasonable and fair. For example, you can set a time limit for public comment, half hour, 2 hours, whatever the board thinks is appropriate. It's got to be in your meeting, or in your rules and procedures. It just can't be ad hoc from meeting to meeting. You can limit the amount of time an individual has for public comment. You can shorten that time if you anticipate a large number of people coming to speak, which I suspect in the near future that you will experience that. You cannot limit their comments to just what appears on the particular CPRB agenda pursuant to which the meeting is being conducted. However, you can limit public comment to CPRB matters. For example, if somebody wants to talk about potholes, to my recollection, that's not a CPRB matter. You can limit them so they can't provide that information. There is no requirement, you cannot ask for a speaker's address or residential address or any address. And finally, there is no requirement for a CPRB member to answer questions, to engage in debate, to get into squabbles, or in any way answer or talk to a member of the public. That's up to you. If you have questions about the Open Meetings Act, feel free to contact the Legal Division or the City Clerk's office. Let me turn to the Freedom of Information Act, or as we call it here, FOIA. And this will be brief. This is not going to be an expansive discussion on FOIA. Any written or electronically recorded communication by CPRB members among themselves or with other people, staff, the public, whatever, if it's in writing or electronically retained, that can be subject to a Freedom of Information Act request. It could be emails, it could be text messages, it could be voice messages, it could be video messages, it could be mail correspondence, and it doesn't matter that your personal device, your cell phone, your home computer is used. If it's among, or if it involves CPRB business, even if it doesn't involve another member, it could be subject to production in FOIA. Now, maybe some of the information in those communications, hard copy or electronic communications, might be exempt under FOIA. Then that information can be redacted, or the whole document, depending on what's in the document, can be withheld. It's the city that handles FOIA requests, not the CPRB. Though sometimes you may be asked, if there are communications on your personal device, to print them up or forward them in some form or fashion, or download them onto a disk or a thumb drive or into PDF form and forward them to the city clerk's office so they can be put or in the FOIA response, but first reviewed and appropriately redacted. By the way, Section 7 of FOIA provides 44 exemptions pursuant to which information can be withheld, and Section 7.5 provides 50 exemptions that are statutory, where information must be held. And there is a default to allow for any new statutes that come along that require confidentiality. Please understand, FOIA matters, even if they involve the police department or criminal activity or the CPRB, are not subject to the jurisdiction of the CPRB. You don't have authority to rule or decide what to do with FOIAs, or whether a police officer or the chief or the deputy chief responded appropriately. That's up to the city, and it's governed by statute. Thus, if the CPRB gets a complaint from a citizen complaining about how someone in the police department handled a FOIA, that's not a CPRB complaint. That's a complaint under FOIA, and that person has a statutory remedy whereby they can ask the Attorney General's office, the PAC office, Public Access Counsel's office, to review the appropriateness of the city's response. Let's turn now to the Peace Officers Disciplinary Act, or the Police Officers Bill of Rights. This is a very complex statute and must be adhered to strictly. The statute can be found at 50 Illinois compiled statutes, 725/1, but I'm sure if you Google Peace Officers Disciplinary Act, Illinois, you'll get to it. The Act provides a complex set of legally enforceable requirements for investigating sworn officer misconduct. Sounds simple, but when you dig into the statute, you will realize that it is pretty complex, and courts have wrestled with it. Essentially, the Act provides due process to officers whose conduct is being investigated by their employers or by their police department. The Act works in tandem with any collective bargaining agreement between the Police Officers Union, FOP, in our case, Urbana Police Department policies and procedures for investigating misconduct, and City Human Resource policy and procedures for investigating any employee misconduct. The Act governs formal inquiries or formal investigations of officers' misconduct. It does not cover typical employment type, unrelated to police, employment type conduct. For instance, it does not cover a sexual harassment of another employee. The HR policies, the city's HR policies and procedures would govern that. The Act doesn't govern criminal investigations. Statutes, the Illinois and the U.S. Constitutions govern those. Like the Open Meetings Act, this Act builds on a set of seemingly simple definitions, but as you're about to find out, some of them are not as easy to apply as one might think, unless one has experience and training in how to work under the Peace Officers Disciplinary Act. Officer is only sworn police officers are deemed covered under the Act. An officer and trainee that has yet to be sworn in as a police officer, the Act does not apply. As I say, this Act affords due process to sworn police officers. A sworn officer is an officer that meets the qualifications and is sworn in pursuant to state statute. Thus, our police service representatives, our parking enforcement, our administrative staff types, they are not covered under this Act. Supervisors, those are the command staff within the Urbana Police Department. They are our sergeants, our lieutenants, our deputy chief of police, and our chief of police. Now we get to a little bit more difficult definition, informal inquiry. And one has to understand the clear language of this definition because it's critical, because it is distinguishable from a formal inquiry. An informal inquiry is a meeting between an officer and one or more of his or her supervisors to either mediate a citizen complaint or discuss allegations to determine whether a formal investigation, a formal inquiry, might be warranted. Usually someone from Human Resources and the Legal Division and a union representative, along with the officer, are present during those situations when those types of informal inquiries are handled. A formal inquiry is quite different. That's an investigation that is ordered by the chief of police or his or her designation, in which an officer is questioned for the purpose of gathering evidence of misconduct and may be the basis for discipline or charges, as the Act sometimes says, for seeking a termination, a demotion, or a suspension in excess of 3 days. If after, let's say, an informal inquiry is done, a determination is made, even if all the allegations are proven true, it would not lead to termination, demotion, or suspension in excess of 3 days, the process, at least under the Act, pretty much stops. Then we have interrogation. This is questioning of an officer pursuant to the Act and the Urbana Police Department's formal investigation procedures. And again, this may lead to a determination that the officer should be terminated, demoted, or suspended for a period in excess of 3 days. Interrogation is not part of an informal inquiry, or conversely, an informal inquiry does not include interrogation. Interrogation is not applicable to minor infractions of policy and procedures, i.e., those that won't result in termination, demotion, or suspension in excess of 3 days. Here at the city, the interrogation starts with swearing in the officer under oath, and typically the court reporter retained by the city administers that oath. The commanding officer, that's not necessarily the chief, it can be a sergeant, a lieutenant, a deputy chief, or the chief, and we'll talk about why typically the deputy and the chief are not there for this, but the commanding officer directs the officer to be honest in his or her answers, as well as provide complete responses to questions. If the officer fails in either respect, that could be a separate charge and grounds for termination, because that would be considered insubordination, not necessarily police officer misconduct on the job, but insubordination. However, there is something called garrity rights, and I'm sure some of you have heard about garrity rights. But just to quickly review, an officer that makes an admission against his or her own interests, that admission under oath cannot be used by anyone should there be a criminal investigation into that officer's conduct, because that officer is required to choose whether to lie under oath and possibly give up his job, or make an admission against self-interest under oath that could be the difference between guilt and innocence in a criminal investigation. So under U.S. Supreme Court case Garrity, those kinds of admissions cannot be used by the prosecutor in a criminal action. The final term of importance for your purposes is collective bargaining agreement, and of course that's the contract between the city and its police union, FOP in our case. General requirements of the Act. As I said, the Act is to protect due process rights of officers. Prior to an interrogation, and we've defined that, an officer must be advised regarding admissions, that at least in this proceeding under the Act, they can be used as evidence against the officer. May not be used in evidence in a criminal case, but certainly can be used for part of the ultimate determination regarding discipline. The officer has a right to counsel. Sounds like Miranda, but the officer has a right to counsel. And let's say the interrogation starts, and the officer says, you know what? I'd like to retain an attorney or consult my attorney. Just like a criminal investigation, all interrogation should and must stop until the officer retains an attorney or has the opportunity to consult his or her attorney. And by the way, that attorney has the right to be present at the interrogation. The interrogation, for our purposes, has to be at the city building and has to be during a reasonable time of the day and not when the officer is normally off duty. The length of sessions must be reasonable, and here in the city, we do not conduct interrogations beyond 3 hours unless the officer wants to continue. The officer is entitled to take reasonable breaks for whatever. I'll leave that to your imagination. During the interrogation, an officer cannot be compelled to take a polygraph test or answer questions under some kind of chemical substance. During the interrogation, there can be no abuse of the officers, no threat of charges or discharge. As I indicated, it will be recorded by a court reporter who will prepare a transcript, and a copy of the transcript must be made available to the officer or his or her employee free of charge. The officer's exercise of any one or more rights under the Act cannot be a basis for discipline or threats or retaliation. By the way, the officer's rights under the Peace Officers Disciplinary Act do not, I repeat, do not diminish citizens' rights under the Illinois Constitution or the U.S. Constitution or any state or federal statute. There are special issues that arise, and this is why it is very important that the people who conduct these inquiries, informal inquiry, formal inquiry, and these investigations and interrogations have to be trained and very familiar with this act. The officer has to be advised in a written document what the nature of the investigation entails. It may also include a list of the policies, Urbana Police Department policies or procedures that govern or that are believed to have been violated that have caused the process to commence. Complaints may trigger, as I said, formal investigations, and therefore complaints regarding conduct covered under the Act must be under sworn affidavit. Thus, a complaint that could give rise to termination, demotion, or suspension in excess of 3 days must be sworn to. And while I was not here when your ordinance was enacted, I am sure the form that requires a sworn affidavit and contains that provision to comply with this act. If any part of an affidavit is found to be untruthful, knowingly untruthful, the city is obligated under statute to turn that affidavit and the name of the person executing the affidavit and any information that might be available regarding that person over to the state's attorney's office for possible prosecution. That's how serious the legislature takes this Peace Officers Disciplinary Act. Thus, a CPRB complaint, which is not signed under oath, can't be, for instance, used to commence a Peace Officers Disciplinary Act investigations. Officers must be informed of the name, rank, and unit of the commanding officer who's in charge of the investigation, whether it's a sergeant, lieutenant, deputy chief of police, or the chief of police. Same with the interrogators. If somebody from my division, an assistant city attorney, typically Michelle Brooks, conducts the interrogation or participates in it, her name and her title must be provided to the officer in writing. All persons who will be present on behalf of the city, including somebody from HR, finance department, their name and their title must be included. By the way, the officer must provide the city with the names of, including attorney, of any person that he or she will have present, including the union representative. I mentioned something about the chief before. The chief and often the deputy chief are not included in these interrogations and formal investigations because the chief or his or her designee is ultimately tasked with reviewing everything that comes out of these investigations and formal inquiries to determine what discipline should be meted out. Witnesses who are going to present evidence are not present until their evidence is to be presented. Very much like they're barred from a courtroom in criminal proceedings, so their evidence can't be tainted. As I said, admissions against self-interest can't be used in criminal proceedings. They also cannot be used in any subsequent disciplinary proceeding. Maybe they find ultimately that no discipline, police department discipline, termination, demotion, suspension in excess of 3 days is warranted, but there may be some human resources type discipline that might be meted out. None of the admissions that the officer makes can be used against him or her. That is another reason why these investigations have to be handled by trained people who have experience handling these investigations. So as I indicated, before any investigation or interrogation commences, there must be a determination whether, if proven, it falls within this act, i.e. it could lead to termination, demotion, or suspension in excess of 3 days. Bottom line, the act, Urbana Police Officer or Police Department policies and procedures, HR policies and procedures, and the collective bargaining agreement and case law and constitutional law are the only rules, generically, that apply. CPRB rules do not apply to these proceedings. The Act does not provide any city board or commission authority to have an impact on these types of investigations. In conclusion, if you have questions about the Peace Officers Disciplinary Act, feel free to contact somebody in the legal division, myself, Kurt Borman, by the way, who's a former police officer, and Michelle Brooks, who has extensive experience in this act. Once again, I thank you for your service, and I think everyone here thanks you for your service. You are entering a period that should be exciting for you. Have a good day.